Greetings, everyone. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're staying healthy wherever you are. I hope you're not going too stir crazy. Western Civ, however, marches on. And today we move away from political history more towards cultural history. And we'll be talking about modernism. Now, what is modernism? Well, always have to define words when you use them. And this one is somewhat difficult because modern, as it is commonly used in everyday parlance, is something that is up to date. And that is true whenever you are in history. There's always going to be something that's up to date. And later on, it's going to be out of date, right? So we can talk about, say a smartphone is modern technology. Whereas at one point, say, punch cards were modern technology. They're not modern anymore because technology has moved on. However, if you put a capital M in front of modernism, then you've sort of changed the meaning of this word. It's really weird. At one point, this word modern described something that was particularly new, particularly shocking, particularly up to date. And it got stuck there, describing that thing. Even though it is well in the past now, we still talk about it as modernism. Okay? Which leads us to postmodernism. All right? Maybe you've heard of this word. If you go to graduate school in the humanities, you'll hear no end of it. Okay? Postmodern on the surface makes no sense. It's sort of talking about what? Like in the future? But no, when you're talking about postmodernism, you're talking about the successor movement to modernism. Okay, and modernism, ironically, is now firmly in the past. Okay? So, modernism, capital M modernism, is a literary, artistic, and cultural movement that started going into the 19th century and then really got going in the 20th century. Okay, particularly after the First World War. All right? And yeah, it is up to date. It is new. And it is, I guess we could say that it's a dissident movement. All right? A lot of modernists were highly skeptical of the European tradition. All right? In some ways, they wanted to completely tear it all down and start again from scratch. Okay? So that is hopefully we'll be exploring some of this today. Hopefully it'll be a little bit more clear by the time that we're done. Okay. So we'll start where I talk about modernism by talking about art. Art is often on the vanguard of cultural movements. And modernism really does take hold in the art world. Now, if you were to go to the center of the art world in the mid-19th century, that is Paris, you would see that the style that predominated was the academic style. All right, that is, to be an artist, you needed like a degree. You had to go to the art academy and you had to study. And what you would study is what had been discovered during the Renaissance and then passed on down. It was a great tradition that involved learning how to represent things accurately with foreshadowing and perspective and proper shading. All right. But it would also, you wouldn't just depict anything. You would depict something heroic, something noble, something uplifting. Okay. And this is the academic style, and this is what art was expected to be. And to prove it, there's a biennial exhibition called the Salon, and lots of artists in Paris, right? And they submit their work to the jury at the Salon, And if it's accepted for the exhibit, that's pretty cool. I mean, you know you're on your way to making it if you get to exhibit at the salon. And what they're looking for is, well, there's a painting there, which is very much in the academic style. It's by a guy named Ingres, and it depicts Joan of Arc. All right, who was a, well, if you take my History 111 course, you'll learn about Joan of Arc. Okay, she was a French peasant girl who, in the early 15th century, basically went to the Dauphin, the the heir to the Kingdom of France, and gave him his spine back, and sort of told him to go relieve the siege of Orleans, which is what the English were besieging. And then they snuck behind enemy lines and held a coronation ceremony for him at Reims Cathedral, which is the traditional venue for the coronation of French kings. And so this was a major propaganda victory for the French during the 100 Years' War. And so Joan of Arc, who was subsequently actually captured by the English and burnt at the stake for witchcraft, okay, she becomes a great French national hero. In fact, later on, she was canonized as a saint. That was not the case in 1854 when this painting was painted, but it's clear that she she's a great hero. There she is in her suit of armor. Okay, I guess they put on a skirt for her so that she could retain a little bit of femininity there. But she's got, you can tell she's holy. She's got a halo on her head, and she's gazing off, sort of, she's got her eye on God. She's got, in the one hand, the oriflamme, a sacred French war banner, and on the other, she's got her hand on the altar, which is, no place for a woman in the Middle Ages, but she is so special that we'll make an exception for her. All right, and you can tell, looking behind, you've got peasants and even a priest there with his tonsure kneeling. Are they? Is this in honor of the king, or are they in fact venerating Saint Joan of Arc while she's still alive? So that's the sort of thing. I mean, it's representational, right? There's no doubt who this is, and there's no doubt that she is someone who's very important, right? This painting is balanced. I mean, she's at the center of interest. You've got, people on the one side, the altar on the other, okay? It all works as a composition. And so that's, I'm sure that you could get an art historian to say more about this painting, and there's certainly lots of other paintings. They depict mythological scenes, they depict great scenes in history, they depict important people in history. They do it in a beautiful manner, but also a meaningful manner, and that is what art is and what art ought to be. Okay, we talked a little bit about realism. Okay, that it is in writing, realism it's kind of it's the opposite of romanticism. I mean, romanticism, the author is always trying to tell you how he feels about something, but a realist thinks that that's not good advice. A realist writer says, show me, don't tell me. So realist writers would go and describe things as accurately as they could and let the thing speak for itself. Remember this? Don't say, "Oh, I felt terrible at watching this." You describe it so that you can't help but feel terrible when you read about it. And there's a parallel movement in art as well. Edouard Manet was a realist painter. All right, and realists, they they were kind of moral about their painting. Okay, that is that Ingres. Okay, he paints Joan of Arc. But this is a confection on his part. This is artificial. He wasn't there. He did not witness this. This is just something that he would like to believe happened. And Manet and people like him said that there's something immoral about that. That since you weren't there, You're not allowed to come up with something like this. That real art is what you witness, what you see with your eyes. And if it's, just because it isn't dignified or heroic, doesn't mean it isn't valuable. All right, so realists would go around and they'd notice things and they'd paint them. They might, so they'd get out of the studio, you see, and they'd go out and they would paint things that they saw. They might do a sketch and then finish it off in the studio. But that's sort of what they do. They're all about the here and the now. And the main thing is, I actually saw this. I actually witnessed this. This is, in artistic terms, it's a primary source. Okay, and so Manet, apparently, if we're to believe him, he actually saw this family out on the deck on a Sunday afternoon. Maybe after church, they've come back and they're just enjoying a little bit of people watching. It's a nice bourgeois family there with dad and mom and the daughter and their little dog. All right, does it mean anything? No, not really. It's just something he saw. Okay, there is apparently in the background, you can't really see it, but there is the sort of shadowy figure of a servant in the background. So if there's any statement to be made by this painting, it is, it's as ever, the rich family gets to enjoy the sun while the servant still has to work. But I don't know if that's the main point of this painting. It's a painting, he's basically saying, I saw this. I saw this. I didn't confect it in a studio. And that continues. Okay, that notion of I actually saw this. This continues with the Impressionists, of whom perhaps the most important is Claude Monet. Okay, it's one of the ironies of art history that you have a Manet and then you have a Monet. Just remember that A comes before O in the alphabet. So Claude Monet is an impressionist. He did paint outside, and he painted very quickly. Okay, so he could dash off one of these paintings in 5, 10, 15 minutes. All right, and so he wouldn't really paint indoors at all. And he painted lots of things. Okay, there's, lily ponds and haystacks and insides of train stations. Here's a series of paintings he did at the facade of Rouen Cathedral. Rouen is the capital of Normandy, and actually it's the place where Joan of Arc was burnt at the stake. But he went there, set up his easel in the square in front of the cathedral, and just painted one after another. All right? And the whole, he did it quickly. Okay? He did it quickly, so he sacrificed all the fine detail that the salon was looking for. But he said, that's not really the point. It's not really the point. My point is that this is what made an impression on me at the time. The way the light hit the facade of the cathedral, that's what I recorded. And so, of course, that's going to change over the course of a day, and so every painting he paints is going to be slightly different. Okay, so that's what it means to be an impressionist. You're painting your impression of what you see. So right there, we're moving away somewhat from representation and towards more of what the artist himself sees. Now you can say that that's kind of self-indulgent in a way, but an artist would say, look, this is what I actually saw, and maybe it will make an impression on you too. Okay, then of course if there's an Impressionism, sure enough there is a Post-Impressionism, and there's a number of Post-Impressionists. Among them, perhaps the most famous of all is Vincent van Gogh, who painted the impression that something made on him. He also sort of painted his feelings, and one of the things, he was probably bipolar, and he would have painted when he was up. All right, and so here is something that was clearly painted when he was up. It's a cornfield with cypresses. The whole thing seems to be shimmering with life. I mean, the cornfield is waving. The cypress tree is sort of swirling out of the ground, and of course the sky is swirling around as well. And that kind of describes his feelings that he saw as he sees this scene. Unfortunately, if he's up, sometimes he's down as well. And of course, famously, Van Gogh cut off his ear, and then, of course, he ended up killing himself, which is a shame. But his paintings are certainly very famous. He was Dutch. He worked in the south of France, and at one point it was, his paintings went for millions and millions of dollars. Okay, another post-impressionist was Gauguin. All right, who was a stockbroker. But then he decided to give it up and go to a French colony, Tahiti, where he painted them. And there you go. That is modernism right there, isn't it? Here's a guy who's doing very well for himself on the stock market. Presumably he makes enough money that he can do stuff, but he gives it up. He quits. Why? Because this whole thing is BS, man. This whole thing is just making money for the sake of making money, is soulless and shallow. And in fact, all of European bourgeois society is basically sick. What I want to do is I want to go to a place where people are a little bit unsullied by civilization. And so he goes to Tahiti, and that's part of his shtick, was painting the native people there, who he saw as elemental and closer to the earth and more authentic than Europeans are. Now, needless to say, there's a great deal of criticism of this now. That he himself was an imperialist in his own way, that he's exploiting these native people for his own benefit. All of that is taken. I'm just pointing out that is an aspect of modernism. You find a renewal of Western civilization in the native, in primitive peoples. Okay, another aspect of modernism, all right? Pablo Picasso is, your archetypical modern artist. He was Spanish, active in Paris, and he went through any number of careers. All right, he was kind of like David Bowie or Madonna. He was always changing his style, changing his image. He started life. His sort of first phase was as a cubist. All right, and cubism is basically, it's like deconstructing a physical object and showing it in more than one side of it at once. And so that's his vision of what you can do with a violin. By sort of seeing different sides at once. And you say, why on earth would you want to do that? And Picasso would say, why not? Why should we be confined to 3 dimensions? Why can't we see in more than 1 dimension? All right. Now, to criticize this is like, look, it looks like a perfectly good violin that was run over by a truck, right? Well, no, that's not what you're supposed to think. All right, you're supposed to think that, wow, isn't that cool? Who ever thought that you could show more than one side of an object like that? All right, and similarly, here's a very famous Picasso painting it's cubist. It's called Demoiselles d'Avignon. These are prostitutes from Avignon. Sex, of course, is elemental, and you'll notice that a couple of them are actually wearing African masks. Again, it's like Gauguin in Tahiti. You go to these African masks. He went to an exhibit of African masks. He was deeply impressed, and he started using them in his work. All right, and so we're going to Africans are elemental, and so we're going to find a renewal of European civilization in that. Needless to say, you can criticize that as well. But again, this is it's part of the times. All right. And then finally, here is what is this? Well, it's not really anything at all. All right. It only makes sense if we are, you'll notice that over the course of this, we've been moving away from representation. And with every new movement, it looks less and less like something you might actually encounter in real life. And it was only a matter of time before it broke free completely. from representation. And one of the first movements to do that was called Expressionism. One of the Expressionists was known as Vasily Kandinsky, and he was a Russian active in Munich, okay, and he painted a lot of paintings that looked like this. And you're not going to get any hint what it actually represents. As you can see, it's just composition 4. All right, composition 4. What does this represent? Well, nothing really. Kandinsky would say that it is an expression. I mean, as he's painting something. He's trying to express a mood. He's trying to express his emotions. And he's just painting until he feels he gets it right. And if it provokes a different emotion in you, well, that's okay. He would say that what he's doing is actually harder than what the salon style was doing. The salon style, okay, you'd get a girl, you'd put her in a Joan of Arc suit, you'd put her in her studio, she would have to be still for 8 hours a day as you painted her, okay? You had something to go on. But Kandinsky didn't have anything to go on except his own feelings, okay? So he was just painting until he felt that, that's it. That's what I'm thinking about. Again, the criticism of this is what? My kid could do that. My kid could draw like that. But that's, no, your kid can't do that. Your kid doesn't have the theory that Kandinsky has. Okay? And so, yeah, so you're probably wondering what happened, how did this get popular? Well, back, sort of the Impressionists, all right, back in Paris, they would, if you're refused from the salon, you can always say, okay, I'll try harder next time. Or you can take your ball and go home. And the Impressionists launched their own salon. It was called the Salon des Refusés, okay? The Salon of the Rejects, okay? And so they wore that as a badge of pride. And then from there, it went on. It was sort of cool to be rejected from the real salon, and then you would start exhibiting this, and it attracted more and more interest, and more and more people would contribute to that, and it just got less and less representational as time went on. Now, why is this? Why did this happen now? Why did it happen in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that we moved away from representation? Why didn't this happen in the 18th century or the 12th century? What is it about capital M modernism that does this? Well, part of the reason is the advent of technology, as ever, right? And in this case, you have the invention and widespread dissemination of the camera. All right? So all of a sudden, all of those skills that artists needed to learn about foreshadowing and perspective and shading and all of that is redundant. Okay? If you want a portrait painted of yourself, well, you could get a portrait painted, or you could just get a photographer to take a picture of you. All right? It's probably a lot cheaper, and it represents you more accurately. All right. So on some level, just technology frees up art to go in its own direction. Art is now free to not to be representational. But okay, as you can probably imagine, the Salon des Refusés. All right, there is a great deal of, shall we say, skepticism of the European tradition. All right. Just like Gauguin gives up his job as a stockbroker, so also if the squares can't get this, great. All right, this is the sort of thing that your parents would hate, right? It's kind of like that. It's kind of like the early days of rock and roll music. This is stuff that is really outre and is calculated to offend the squares. All right, so there's a great deal of that in modernism, and that comes to a head. Well, a shining example of this, okay, took place in 1913 in Paris. Now we're not talking about painting. as much as we are talking about dance, in particular ballet. Okay, there was a ballet company founded in 1909 in Paris called the Ballet Russe. That is the Russian ballet. It was composed largely of expatriate Russians. I don't know if they had been expelled from Russia, but they were generally expatriates hanging out in Paris and really quite avant-garde. So their main composer, Igor Stravinsky, composed The Rites of Spring, which was performed in 1913. Vaslav Nijinsky was the main dancer, and it was a seminal moment in modernism. Okay, when it debuted, the opening night, the audiences were shocked to discover really dissonant music, dancing that was deliberately awkward. It was a big thumb in their, thumbing the nose to the whole ballet tradition, right? And then, of course, the idea is that the rites of spring, the notion is that it's at that point that you come back to life again and you start to mate, and that's like mating season in the spring. Okay, so there's a great deal of fertility ritual that takes place in the spring, and there was a lot of sexual content in this ballet as well. All right, and so again you see this. Let's get back to elemental stuff here. Pre-Christian fertility rituals. That's cool. And awkward dancing. I mean, who needs all that polished stuff, right? That stuff you go to school to years to learn. No, let's just do something different. All right. And what happened with the Rites of Spring? Here's Nijinsky as the faun. Okay, the audience actually rioted on the open night. Okay, they felt insulted by this. But haha, that's the point, isn't it? What better publicity could you have for your show than if the audience, the bourgeois audience, reacted like that? Okay, so of course that's 1913. You all know what happened in 1914, right? The First World War broke out. That briefly put the kibosh on, these ideas of skepticism and dissidence. All right? For a brief while, everyone was French or German or Austrian, but the war didn't end as quickly as people bargained for. And it just kept on going and going and going and killing more and more people. And to what end? No real end at all. And so that really, the dissidents came back and they say, see, look what has happened to European civilization. It's basically just a big suicide pact. And so it's in that context that you've got Dada, all right? Dada is not art, it is anti-art. Dada, one of the big names associated with Dada was Marcel Duchamp, who was active in Zurich in Switzerland. So I guess since Switzerland was neutral, they couldn't, they didn't have censorship, all right? And so Marcel Duchamp could express his discontent with European civilization by making works like this, okay? Fountain is simply a urinal. You put it in a museum, all right? That's what art is. It's just a thing to piss in, all right? And then on the other side there, on the left, that's another famous work of Dada. It's got the Mona Lisa, right? One of the most famous paintings in the Western world, with a sort of schoolboy mustache and beard added to it. And then LHOOQ underneath, which is a French pun, right? Because you pronounce those letters LHOOQ in French, which you could also write out as Elle a chaud au cul, all right, which means she has a hot ass. Okay, so that is what art has become. It's not art, it's Dada. Okay, you've taken the Western tradition and you've basically pissed all over it in a particularly juvenile way. But why not, right? The whole thing is crumbling anyways. Life is essentially meaningless. Everything's gone to pot, and so we're going to reflect that artistically. So that's art for you. Obviously, art continues. And, the Western tradition continues in its way as well. But we'll shift a little bit now and talk about scientific discovery. Okay, doubtlessly you've heard about Albert Einstein. It's one of the most famous theoretical physicists ever. Okay, and he formulated the theory of, the theory of special relativity in 1905, then the theory of general relativity in 1916. He was Jewish, Swiss German. His theories had to be sort of smuggled out of wartime Europe, where they got to Britain, and people were just astounded at this. Basically, it had become apparent by the late 19th century that Newton's theories were not as universal as Newton himself believed. Newton described all motion in the universe using his three laws and the universal theory of gravity. And so look at that. The same force that keeps us on the Earth is also the same force that keeps the moon going around the Earth and the Earth going around the sun and all the other planets going around the sun, and so on. You don't need angels. It's just a force of nature that works. All right? And that is just incredible. But the trouble is that Newton's theories didn't quite work. There were enough anomalies in that people started to wonder about them. And what the theory of general relativity states is that time and space are relative. So the faster you go, the heavier you get, the shorter you get, and the slower time moves for you relative to an external observer. All right, and I've never quite been able to wrap my head around this, but I am told by wiser people than me that it is true. If you synchronize two watches and you put one on a plane and you make it go very fast around the world a couple times and you land the plane, what you'll discover is that the clock on the plane it's now slower than the clock that was on the Earth. All right, so time has slowed down relative to the clock on the Earth. And that is the theory of relativity. Einstein himself said that he could be wrong. Like a good scientist, he could be wrong, and so they devised an experiment to test this theory. 1919, they had there was a solar eclipse, and they did simultaneous observations of this eclipse in Africa and in South America, and it was called the Eddington experiment. And what they discovered, in fact, was that starlight was bent by the sun more than what Newton's theories would have predicted. And so that suggests that, yes, indeed, Einstein was right. Newton needs a certain amount of modification. In general, obviously, Newton's laws still apply in most situations, but there are certain exceptions to that. Based on the speed that things are going relative to an observer. Okay, so just as Newton's theories, remember he essentially launched the Enlightenment, right? It was this movement of great human potential. Newton, using his brain, right, got God out of the universe. He explained all motion in the universe using mathematics. And this was like, whoa, that's amazing. That's cool. What else can we do? Right? What else can we do? What else can we discover using the power of our brains? Right? We don't have to listen to the church anymore telling us what to do. We can use our brains and think for ourselves. So it really opens up a whole realm of possibility. Obviously, there's problems with this, right? As we discussed, what happens when people come to different opinions about something, right? Well, we'll just execute you by guillotine, right? But kind of the opposite things happens with Einstein. Okay, especially coming right after the First World War. There's a certain anxiety. There's a certain sadness that there was all this great slaughter in Europe for really nothing. So here's Einstein talking about relativity, and when it seeps out into the popular consciousness, it's like, whoa, Newton proved that nothing is true. Excuse me, Einstein proved nothing is true. Everything is relative. There's no fixed point. There's no nothing is certain anymore. So in the popular mind, relativity was turned into relativism. Okay, there is no truth. And then, of course, there's another theoretical physicist called Werner Heisenberg who formulated the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, basically that you cannot know the speed and the position of a particle simultaneously. But that too, because he called it the uncertainty principle, it was basically like people hear about this and they realize, whoa, everything's up in the air now. We don't know anything anymore. Okay, here's another guy you may have heard of. Not quite as famous as Einstein, but was still very famous in his day. He was Jewish, he was Austrian, in fact, he was from Vienna, and his name was Sigmund Freud, and he was a pioneer of what he called psychoanalysis. Okay? So, what does this say? Freud suggested that, you know, you might think you're rational, but you're not. Okay? There's all sorts of things you would like to believe about yourself, but in fact, you are the victim of urges of which you are only dimly aware. Okay? Um, and it's all got to do with civilizing people. As you start out life as just a mass of id, basically. That was his word for a creature when it's first born. All you want is food and sleep and love from mother. Okay, and when you don't get these things, you scream and holler and cry. All right. Um, Later on, of course, you realize that you can't get what you want by screaming and hollering, and so you have to develop an ego. That is, you have to learn that if you want to get what you want, sometimes you have to repress your desires, and you have to learn to be subtle about it. Okay, you have to adopt strategies to get what you want, and then even later still, you develop a superego that helps you to make sort of moral decisions. I mean, is this the right thing to do? Right? Is this a good thing to do? Would I rather, would I want this done to me, kind of thing? All right. So this is the thing. This is a normal development. Civilization depends upon the development of an ego and then of a superego, but this is not a smooth process. Okay, that every time you kind of it entails basically trauma, developing these things, and there's a sort of neuroses that might lurk beneath the surface. So maybe you've heard of the Oedipus complex. That's another thing you want to, in the developing of an ego. You're just a massive id, and you want nothing more than your mother, but at some point you become aware that your mother is sometimes divides her attention between you and this other creature with hairy legs and a deep voice, i.e. your father. And you don't like that, and so if you could, you would murder your father and be united to your mother forever, much like Oedipus in Greek myth. Now, Oedipus, I mean, he didn't do what he did knowingly. All right. So in some ways, that's a bit of a misnomer. But the idea is, according to Freud, is that every child, particularly every little boy, passes through it. He wants to be with his mother forever. He wants to kill the competition. But the father, I believe, according to Freudian theory, the father threatens the son with castration, and that's what helps him to get over his Oedipus complex. Um, and this generally runs smoothly, but in sometimes people have an unresolved Oedipus complex. All right, or made a huge deal about toilet training as well. The whole notion of being anally retentive. That's a Freudian term from toilet training. I mean, you don't like being told to use the toilet. So sometimes you have to sit on the toilet and a child will keep his poop in. He is literally anally retentive because toilet training is so traumatic. Um, so I don't know. Do you believe this? I don't know why, but it all makes intuitive sense, but there's no way to prove it one way or another. Um, I mean, you can't. Generally speaking, we treat mental problems with chemicals now, with serotonin reuptake inhibitors and that sort of thing. But Freud came up with this great theory, and he was very self-confident. It's amazing what you can do if you're self-confident. All right, he got a whole bunch of people to believe him that this is Freud discovered this about human nature. All right, and of course he made a tidy business out of it as well. He trained a bunch of followers, and he himself had a lot of clients who would come and talk about all their problems, and Freud would tell them, well, you're anally expulsive, or you had this traumatic event in your childhood, and that's why you're denying it, you're repressing it, you're projecting it, so on and so forth. You should be talking about it, and then once you become aware of why you've got these problems, then maybe we can do something about it. Okay, so I guess therapy very much is with us now. I don't know if you can get many Freudian therapists anymore. But so Freud does, we do owe that to him. Okay, this notion of you go and talk with someone and they'll help you out with your problems. Okay, and two, Freud. I mean, it's quite true. We are only half rational, right? In some ways, that's like what the Romantics said. You've got reason, but there's this whole other side to you that is not rational, and sometimes it's dark and scary, but you can't dismiss it entirely. All right, so just as relativity was interpreted as relativism in popular consciousness, so also there's what people called pop Freudianism worked its way into popular consciousness as well. And so basically the point is that repression is bad and expression is good. All right, you don't want to keep stuff bottled up inside. If you keep it bottled up inside, it's going to cause all sorts of problems. So you have to let it all hang out, right? And I think that Freud was also ultimately responsible for the sexual revolution in the mid 20th century, where it's perfectly acceptable to have sex outside of marriage. In fact, it's a very good thing. You don't want to repress your sexuality because that's going to lead to problems. Freud himself didn't believe that. I mean, he believed in civilization, and he believed that you should repress certain things about yourself for the greater good. He just acknowledged that it came with a certain price. Okay, a couple more names. I mean, we've talked about how the Enlightenment was skeptical about organized religion. Very few Enlightenment people were actually atheists, though. They were more deists. They believed in a kind of a prime mover. Okay. But now there's skepticism towards Christianity. There's a great deal of this in modernism. And it's not just, skepticism towards organized religion, skepticism towards Christianity, skepticism towards religion in general. On the left, Sir James Frazer, okay, and on the right, Friedrich Nietzsche. Okay. Um, Fraser was an anthropologist at Cambridge University, and when he published The Golden Bough in 1890, that was a really kind of a sort of an outre book because it was the first kind of universal theory of religion. And he talked about how primitive man believes in magic, and then religion, the appeasement of the gods, and later on morality comes into it. All right. So that's at that point that religion starts to endorse the golden rule. But Christianity is by no means the only religion to do this. All right. That Christianity is one religion among many, and it is no more or less true than any other. All right. Which was a bit shocking at the time. People thought that that Fraser was really treating Christianity as a purely historical and cultural phenomenon. He did a great deal to undermine Christianity as revealed truth. Nietzsche himself was also, I mean, much more virulently anti-Christian. In fact, very modern in this way. He just hated much of 19th century civilization, including Christianity. He felt that Christianity was a religion fit only for slaves. That it was Christianity at the beginning was kind of revenge of the nerds. All right. Pagan religion glorified power. All right. But what Christianity did was that it was the religion of the little people. And it was, once it took over, it basically put a guilt trip on people who wanted to make something about themselves. All right. And so this is the Europe that Nietzsche lives in. You've basically got Christianity keeping everyone down, keeping everyone in mental shackles. So he looked forward to the rise of an Übermensch. Okay, that's a very Nietzschean concept, generally translated as the Superman, who was going to be basically beyond good and evil. He will create his own morality. All right. And he was. I recommend Nietzsche to you. I don't say you have to believe it, but he's certainly a very compelling writer. But of course, this whole notion of being beyond good and evil. We all have fantasies about breaking the bonds of morality and kind of doing what we want without feeling guilty about it. But at the same time, you can see how Nietzsche prepared the way for Hitler. I don't Nietzsche though he didn't care for anti-Semites. He thought that anti-Semites were similar. That was a similar slave mentality. But he did a great deal to undermine Christianity. The whole notion of God is dead, that's a Nietzschean notion. God is dead and we have killed him. All right, there's still more modernism in terms of literature. Here are two. Well, one's a poet, the other's a novelist. Maybe you've heard of these two. T.S. Eliot, actually born in America, but he moved to England and basically became indistinguishable from English people. James Joyce was Irish, okay? And they wrote stuff that was unlike anything that had been written before. T.S. Eliot's famous poem is known as The Wasteland, which is basically, it's not like your average poem. It doesn't have much form, it doesn't rhyme, and it doesn't really make much sense. It's just a kind of pastiche of different things, leaving the impression that civilization has exploded and all that's left are the fragments. Okay, one of the lines in the poem is, "These fragments I have shored against my ruins." All right, it begins famously, "April is the cruelest month," which is an inversion of, the beginning of the Canterbury Tales, when Chaucer says, when April with his sweet showers brings to life the earth again. All right, but Eliot sort of takes the reverse of that. We liked it in winter, and now April is waking us up. So that's so when The Wasteland was published in 1922, that was a seminal moment in modernism. Similarly, in the same year, James Joyce wrote Ulysses, which is a novel you can study in English literature, and it is parallels with the Odyssey. It talks about one day in Dublin, June 16th, 1904, and this guy named Harold Steve Bloom, right? Leopold Bloom, and he wanders around Dublin in the same way that Odysseus wanders around the Mediterranean. Um, it's not an easy book to read, okay, because it is stream of consciousness and it involves a great deal of experimental prose, okay. So that's it's just kind of new. It's not in the Western tradition. It's breaking free from that. Okay, finally, we'll talk a little bit about architecture. All right. And another famous aspect of modern architecture is something called the Bauhaus, which was established in Weimar in 1919 and then moved Weimar, Germany, and then moved to Dessau in 1926. And the fact that buildings look like this now is largely something. It's got to do with the Bauhaus. Okay, again, you'd build a public building in the 19th century, you would build it in the classical tradition, and you'd have lots of little curly cues. You'd have capitals and filaments and, entablatures and all sorts of stuff. Neoclassical style, but modern architects have no time for that stuff. One of their things is form follows function. Okay, so the point is that if a building is a box, if it's essentially a box, then it should look like a box. All right, so that's the thing about modern architecture. Okay, and this really took off after the Second World War because they needed to get Europe rebuilt nice and cheap, and so they built public housing projects that looked like this. An architect was named Le Corbusier, and this is his housing project in Marseille, France. Unité d'habitation, he called it. All right? But even still, the bourgeoisie can make use of this as well. Mies van der Rohe was associated with the Bauhaus. When the Nazis came to power, they closed down the Bauhaus. They had no time for this sort of modernism. And so Mies had to come to America, and a lot of ex-Bauhaus people came to America where they spread Bauhaus ideas. And Mies van der Rohe himself was a bit of a chameleon. I mean, he didn't much care for workers' housing. He would work for anyone who hired him, and so he was largely responsible for the Seagram building. It's the headquarters of a capitalist enterprise in New York City. Hey, why not? Okay, it's basically a big glass and steel box, and that works just fine. Okay, so just to sum up some aspects of modernism, the idea is that Europe has become over-civilized. All right, and truth is to be found in primitive people in the far pre-Christian past or in the unconscious. All right. Certainly, you want to strip away tradition as it has accumulated by the early 20th century. And yes, there is a great deal of uncertainty. Nothing is certain. Everything is relative now. So yeah, modernism. It's not necessarily a message of hope.